Well, we zipped really quickly through the end of Matthew 13 last week, and as any artist would do, you step back and you look at it and you go, oh, that's unfinished, and you would like to touch it up again, but I will refrain. There are many things that I think I missed or would have wanted to say, but we'll move on. As we look at the general scope of Matthew as a narrative, as a book, a written book, I've noted some places where Matthew uses some literary techniques, and a lot of those techniques I've referred to as chiasmus. And that is actually a very natural and popular thing to do in Eastern languages, in Eastern cultures, especially historical Eastern cultures, not just Hebrew, but also other cultures as well. There are various techniques around the chiasmus idea, and we talked a little bit about parallelism and the use of parallelism in poetry and various other narratives. We dealt with that a little bit. So there are different ways to do this, to speak and to narrate. And one of the things that I looked at as I looked at the whole book of Matthew is it's not precise, but it seems to me that the whole book kind of has this chiasmus feel to it. And so I just kind of quickly want to run through this. The book of Matthew starts with the idea of heaven. Jesus, Christ, resided in heaven. And we get this little narrative at the beginning of Matthew about the birth and how Christ descended from heaven and was born into this world as creation. And then we get some narrative in Matthew about the ministry startup. You know, the things you have all of the narrative about John the Baptist, and you have the little narrative about the temptations of Christ. So you have a little snippet about starting the ministry and the preparation for the ministry. And then we dive right into a long narration about kingdom living, the Sermon on the Mount. And we went into great detail about that. And then you have a fairly long and not necessarily linear perspective of the Galilean ministry. Now, again, it's not, all of this is not linear per se, so you will find places where, for instance, Jesus made a number of trips to Jerusalem. He was a good Jew. He went to the festivals that were prescribed by law. So not everything happened in Galilee when we say the Galilean ministry, but the focus in Matthew is on Galilee. And then we have in chapter 16 and 17, Peter's declaration of who Jesus is as the Messiah. And we have the Mount of Transfiguration narrative. To me, that seems like the pinnacle of the book. And then we start to back out of that book, or I won't say back out, but it's almost like it's written in a spiral nature because it's going to end at the point where it started. So then we have the Judean ministry. We also have a little bit between here where, and we're going to talk about this in the very near future, where he goes outside of the Jewish territory into the Gentile territory for a moment. And then we have preparation narratives. When we look at Matthew 23, 24, 25, some of those long narratives that he gave specifically to his disciples, but it's really all about, hey, how are we going to live? How are you going to do this? What does life look like after this is all said and done? And then we have the closing out of the ministry, the winding down. The ministry part is over, and now we have the point of sacrifice. And then we have, a return to heaven. And it just fascinates me. I can't pinpoint elements all through there, but if you back up far enough, you can see this interesting pattern which matches this idea of the chiasmus that I've been talking about before. And I think that's fascinating. I don't know, and I think he did. Matthew had to be a smart man. Matthew was a tax collector for the Roman Empire, so he had some wits about him. I'll just go to that extent. And over time, as he's thinking through, chewing on the idea of how would he want to relate this ministry of Jesus, and to whom does he want to relate it, how would he write the narrative in such a way that they would remember it, this may be the design that he had in mind when he mapped this out. And generally speaking, the climax of the spiral, or the climax of the chiasmus, is the most important point. And And that's where we see Peter declaring who he was, who Jesus was. And we see the point of transfiguration where Jesus is talking to Moses and Elijah on the mountain. So I find that interesting, and I just wanted to point that out as we get to a point in Matthew where we're starting to scratch our heads saying, now where are we in the scope of this ministry anyway? Because we're almost halfway through Matthew. But honestly, at this point, the events that we talk about in Matthew 14 are actually occurring, I believe, in the latter half of Jesus' ministry. And that's what we're going to look at next. When we go to the book of John, and the way we can map this out is if we take a couple of things I'm going to say granted, but you know how Matthew hasn't necessarily followed a linear timeline. He's hopped around a lot, or he's categorized or summarized sayings of Jesus or events that occurred in order to make a specific point. He didn't really say, and then this, and then this, and then this, although he does use those phrases to transition from one point to another. But that's not necessarily what he means. He's not mapping it out from a serial perspective. But if we go to the book of John, and we look at a few of the verses there, we have John 2, and I'm just going to put 13. We have 5, 1, 6, 4, and 13, 1. Most scholars view these points in John's gospel as the Passover festivals. So when we go to, let's say, John 2, John tells us it was almost time for the Jewish Passover. Jesus went up to Jerusalem. This is the beginning of his ministry. So this is Passover 1 within the context of his ministry. John 5 doesn't call it a Passover, but it says Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Most scholars think that Jewish festival was another Passover. It might not be, but let's just count it as 2 for now. In 6, John chapter 6, verse 4. Jesus looked up, saw a great crowd. Let's see. Verse 4. The Jewish Passover festival was near. So that's Passover 3. And then 13:1. It was time for the Passover festival. This is coming out of John. So we think in John's narrative there were 4 Passovers. This Passover happens at the beginning of his ministry. Most people think that his ministry started, it was geared up to here for about 3 months before this Passover. And then you had 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. This is basically Easter Sunday. This is the I'll just say sacrifice. The last Passover of his ministry. So if we take John's pattern and we take it as a linear progression through the ministry, the events that we're coming to in Matthew are occurring right around this time. If we line them all out and we say, okay, John actually has the feeding of the 5,000 right here. Well, Matthew 14 has the feeding of the 5,000. So one might say, in the scope of the schedule on the ministry, we are now in the last half of Jesus' ministry and the things that we're going to discuss today. It may be that this one is not a Passover. If it's not a Passover, we're looking at a 1-2 year ministry for Jesus. We're still in the last half. We're still in the downhill roll. Now, if we want to look at it a different way, let's see if I remember this. No, I need to erase that. So, got that? Another way to see Matthew, and I like seeing it this way, and it kind of parallels that chiasmus that I had up here. Matthew starts, we'll say startup, But then he spends a lot of time in the Galilean area. And then if you think of not a technical progression, geographical progression, but an ideological geographic progression. Matthew is writing in a tone that has Jesus walking. Oh, you remember this little Sea of Galilee, Jordan River. You've got the Dead Sea. Jerusalem is somewhere over here. Jesus is taking a path through the book of Matthew, an ideological path from Galilee. So I'm going to say 1. He's going to walk over here to the Gentile area. We're going to have a little snippet going on there. And then he's going to travel here to the Judean area. So this is an intellectual path that I think Matthew is kind of describing for us. Now, Jesus does not remain in these. We find when he's already over here, he makes several trips back to here. So technically speaking, this isn't the structure. But practically speaking, Matthew is leading us through a story that carries Jesus from here in his ministry to here in his ministry. So it's leading our minds from Galilee to Jerusalem. So I kind of like that Gentile area and then Jerusalem or Judea. I think that's another way of describing what we're reading and the progression we're reading through Matthew. So we are at a point in Matthew 14 that describes the death of John the Baptist. I should have left that little thing there. Covered that. Matthew 14, verse 1. Let's go ahead and read this part. Matthew 14, I'm going to read 1 through the beginning of 13. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist, who is risen from the dead. This is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It's not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered John a prophet. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for the guests and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted, and he had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. So Matthew gives us what seems to be a flashback here, because he starts with this introduction. Verse 1 is an introduction. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports of Jesus. Well, what reports? Well, the stuff that Jesus was doing, all the miracles that he was doing. And he's doing it in Galilee. Now, we have to ask a question. Which Herod? Who's Herod? Let me draw this again. We have our little Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. If you remember Herod the Great, you know what? Galilee. I'm moving over. Dead Sea, Jerusalem, Nazareth, Capernaum. Okay. So if you remember, things kind of started with this guy named Herod the Great. Who was Herod the Great?
He's the one that ordered the babies.
He is the one that ordered all of the infants or babies in Bethlehem to be killed, 2 years and under. Because he heard this story about a new king coming to Jerusalem or coming to Israel, and he didn't like that idea because he was king in Israel. If you remember the Intertestament period studies we did, his daddy was kind of the one who negotiated Rome coming in and taking over Israel. And they were from a territory way down here in the Edomites, the Idumeans. So Herod the Great wasn't even a natural Jew. Now, he grew up understanding the Jewish culture and the Jewish religion, but he wasn't actually a natural Jew. And so he did some pretty bad things. A lot of bad things, including killing the babies in Bethlehem. But when he died, he actually ended up killing a couple of his own sons. He never could quite decide who was going to be his successors. Several different people were going to be his successors throughout time. But when he died, this area of Israel was divided up into 4 parts. Eventually, it was divided up into 4 parts. And 3 of his sons got those 4 parts. Now, usually the firstborn would usually get the double portion. And you hear things like Elisha asking Elijah, may I have the double portion? That doesn't mean I want twice the amount of power you have. It just means I want to be your successor. I want to be the next in line. So the next in line got the double portion. And that was essentially Judea and Samaria. So we had Herod. Let me get the Herod family is all messed up. So let me make sure I'm getting it right. Herod Archelaus. Eventually, Herod Archelaus got this section of rule over Jerusalem. So we have Herod Archelaus. Now, eventually Rome pulled him out because a lot of people didn't like him, and there was a bunch of trouble stirred up, including his own brothers, stirred up trouble for him. So eventually Rome said, pish posh, you're gone. And I think he ruled for about 9 years, 9 or 10 years. And so Rome eventually took over this area, which is also why we see Pilate in control of that area at the point of Jesus' death. There was another Herod, and this Herod was Antipas, Antipas. Herod Antipas gets this area, the area of Galilee, and this little area here on the eastern coast or eastern shoreline of the Jordan River. I think this is because a lot of these Jews to travel to Jerusalem took this route. Remember that route that was on the eastern side, and then they crossed back over Jordan to come up? So I think that's the reason this little sliver was given to Herod Antipas. And then there was this other descendant, and we're going to call him Philip. 1 L, 2 L's. 1 L looks like. Philip got that area. And so these people are called the tetrarchs. Tetrarchs is a ruler over a 4-part, a fourth of the part. So Archelaus gets 2 of those 4 parts. Antipas gets 1 of those parts. And then Philip gets another 1 of those parts. We should not confuse this Philip with another Philip called Herod the Second, whose name was Philip.
Oh, give me a break. We'll try not to get.
Well, here's another twist. Herod had another son that he killed who had a daughter named Herodias.
Very creative.
Yeah.
And Herodias,
A lot of imagination.
because Herod the Great orphaned his mom, or orphaned her by killing off her mom and dad, he said, okay, fine, you can go get married to Herod Philip, Herod the Second. This is Herodias that is in our story. She married Herod the Second, Philip, not Philip the Tetrarch. I know, this is crazy. Herod the Second was actually the second, I believe it was the second, he was one of the people in line to inherit the entire kingdom. I believe, I want to say Aristobulus was the first one. I could be wrong. I had to go back and research that. Aristobulus got killed. Aristobulus, if I have the right name, had a plot to kill Herod the Great. And Herod the Great found out about it and said, turned the tables, killed him. In fact, I think Aristobulus might have been Herodias' father. Could be wrong on that. It's a convoluted family. Dysfunctional. And so as soon as Aristobulus was no longer the successor, Herod II was supposed to be the successor. But Herod the Great didn't like that idea because Herod II's mother knew about the plot and didn't prevent it. And so he took Herod II out of the will, shipped him off to Rome. Herod II apparently, word has it, didn't want to be ruler anyway, and so he went to live a private life in Rome. Herodias went with him. They were living in Rome. So eventually, the country was divided into 4 parts and given to these 3 sons. Now, these 3 sons made several trips to Rome. On one of those trips, Antipas stayed with Philip and Herodias, and Herodias was like, I like this guy. And he says, I like this woman. And so Herodias divorces Philip, goes with Antipas. Antipas was already married to a princess from Syria. So he had to nix that marriage. Got in trouble for that because the daddy didn't really like it and eventually took out all of his army, basically, and would have killed Antipas had Rome not gotten involved. So Antipas got divorced from his wife. Herodias got divorced from her husband, and they hooked up. And Antipas was over the Galilean area. Antipas was over some very devout religious Jews. The religious law said that the circumstances of that marriage was unlawful. John, being unafraid to voice his opinions and speak the truth, he spoke out publicly against that situation. That caused Antipas to get upset and frustrated, shipped him off to prison. Now, Antipas didn't want to kill John. Why?
Because of the people.
The people. The people, if you get rid of John, Antipas was just as wary of riots as...
We are?
I almost said that, but yeah, as many rulers are. And so he was afraid the people would riot and rebel. So he didn't want to get rid of John in that way, but he did want to remove him from the picture because John had a huge following, and he didn't like John. Now, it's interesting because one of the Gospels says he liked to listen to John. John piqued his curiosity, but not enough. So, Antipas had John put in prison, and John was put in prison at a place, I'm going to say, somewhere right around here. It was a place, let me see if I can find the name. Macarius was the name. Macarius used to be, I'll write that, Machaerus, Macarius. And I'm sure I'm massacring that pronunciation. It used to be a fort. It used to be a citadel for security. But over time, as Roman Empire kind of made some peace across the land, it was converted. It was still used for security, but it also converted into we'll say castle, a palace. It was one of Herod's palaces. And so Herod kind of tucked him away down here and put John in prison way down there. So that's where John is when all of this occurs. Now, what I do not know, and I didn't really study it hard, I don't know that it matters so much, but where does this dance take place? Where does the birthday party happen? It very likely could have happened down here. He may have spent his birthday away from home and got out of town and went down to the palace down here to have a party. And I say that because it seems like the request was made while Salome was still present in the birthday party. Because the head was brought to Salome on the platter, she brought the head to her mother, and so it seems like things took place in a pretty rapid succession there. Whereas if it was up here, he would have had to send a messenger, and it's about a 2 to 3 days journey, depending on the method of travel, to get down to here, have it done, and then transport said head back up. Yeah, it would be a pretty stinky head by that point, yeah. Yeah. But, so that may be how it happened. So that was the Herod, one of many sons. Herod was, this is the Herod that was also in place when Jesus had his trials. Now, the successor Herods that we read about in Acts didn't come through Antipas. The successors actually came through, I want to say, poor guy that got killed. Had kids.
How are all those related? Herod the Great, Herod.
This is Daddy.
Are they all brothers?
All of these are brothers.
Well, that's what I thought. And then the sisters
Uh-huh.
went with the brother? She was the brother's.
I thought
No,
she
it's
was
a daughter.
She went with
It's a
her
daughter.
uncle.
Daughter. And
Because she was orphaned.
Right.
Herod said, oh, well, you can go get married to your uncle.
Yeah?
And so she didn't like that idea, so she got married to her other uncle.
kept it in the family.
Keep it in the family. Now, another interesting twist, if we pursue this Philip married a girl named Salome. We don't necessarily know if it was this Salome, because Herodias apparently had a daughter with Philip named Salome. And that's the Salome that did the dancing. We don't know if this Salome is that Salome or it's another Salome. Salome was not an unpopular name back then, so it could have been another Salome. But it's crazy the way that works. And I know you've been tracking with me. Am I on track or?
Yeah.
Oh,
It says Salome was Herod Philip the first's daughter. Is her first husband's daughter.
yes. Yeah, so they had Salome, but then Philip married a person named Salome, but we don't know if it was the same Salome or not. Yeah.
Wouldn't put it past him.
Wouldn't put it past him? No. But if so, you have a granduncle marrying a grandniece. There's a huge age difference if you go to that point. So I'm not necessarily willing to make that jump, but given the family, I wouldn't doubt it.
The whole thing is rather stinky.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
Soap opera.
Soap opera. That's right. It's definitely made for soap opera. So that is which Herod. Okay. So the next question I have, which is, I erased it, but remember our 4 Passovers up here.
Uh-huh.
If we ask the question, how long was John in prison? He was not in prison at the first Passover. John tells us that he was still alive. But by the second Passover, it looks like, or if we call Matthew or John 5 verse 1 a Passover, if that is a Passover, it looks like John was already put in prison by that point. We are now around the events of the second Passover. So John was, if we follow that plan, in prison for over a year, under 2 years, about a year and a half. If John 5:1 was not a Passover, then it would be somewhere within a year that he was in prison. The interesting question I had as I was reading through this is, what kind of dance was it? You know, I ask these weird questions.
There's no doubt in my mind what kind of dance it was.
Well,
Yeah, mine either.
has anyone
Seductive?
ever heard of the Dance of the Seven Veils? Okay. The Dance of the Seven Veils is actually a story or a play that was written in France. It was written as a play called Salome in 1891 by Oscar Wilde. It was translated into English in 1893 and named Dance of the Seven Veils. There is some liberal not translation, but a liberal way of seeing this as those veils. There's a couple ways of seeing it. The veils could be like peeling an onion, where you remove a veil throughout the scope of the dance to eventually reveal a lot more of the body than you started with. Or it could be similar to the can, in which you didn't remove the veils, but the hint that was seen at times when the dance was done, you see through the veils at certain openings, and that was kind of the touch of lasciviousness that could be there. Yeah.
I have read, but can't remember the source, that it would have been extremely demeaning for a woman of her station to go and dance in front of a bunch of drunken guests under any circumstance.
Agreed. And I want to relate this, and I think that's right, and I want to relate it to Queen Vashti in Esther.
She refused.
Now, it doesn't specifically say in Esther that she was asked to dance, but she was asked to show herself because she was beautiful. So, I think there was probably a tie there. That she was asked to do the same kind of dance that Salome did perform. Interesting that it was Salome and not Herodias, but maybe Herodias was too old, but wait a minute, Herodias was actually quite younger already. But anyway.
I think her mother prompted her. I think her
Absolutely.
parents behind it.
Absolutely.
Anyway,
She was probably a teenager.
used her.
Yes, she was used and abused. Absolutely. So it could have been something like a veiled dance. We honestly don't know how far back or how broad the veiled dance might have been at that point in time, because this was first century. But there were dances, and we think they had veils at that time, even prior to that. Here's another one, belly dance. Now, it's not proper for us to actually call it a belly dance anymore, but belly dancing apparently was also an old kind of dance that they did at that time. It could have been something, a combination of both, or similar to that. Now, I want to take you to a couple passages in the Bible. The first one is the Song of Songs, Song of Solomon, chapter 6, verse 13. This particular section, and Song of Solomon or Song of Songs is a lascivious type of book. It is definitely a romance-oriented book. And if you go to chapter 6, near the end, verse, what did I say? 13? It's basically like a play. And so you have the narrators, which is kind of the friends of Jerusalem, or the people of Jerusalem. And then you have the two lovers, the boy and the girl, or the young man and the young lady. And the friends of Jerusalem say, come back, O Shulamite. Now, Shulamite was the reference to the young lady. There's a lot of judgment of what Shulamite actually means and what that represents. But, O Shulamite, come back, that we may gaze on you. Sound like Vashti? Okay, or Vashti. And then he says, well, why would you gaze? He's asking a hypothetical question. Why would you gaze on the Shulamite as the dance of the Mahanaim?
That's it.
Yeah, just like that. And then he answers his own question. How beautiful your sandaled feet, O princess daughter. Your graceful legs are like jewels, the work of an artist's hand. Your navel is a round goblet, blah, 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 blah. And so he describes how she has beauty, and it's like this dance. So I think even in the time of Solomon, we assume that this was written by or around during Solomon's realm. I actually think it was written by the lady.
Very interesting.
I do, but we won't go there today. But even back then, I think they had dances like this. And we know they did because of Esther. But this is one of those kinds of things that it's a lascivious kind of thing. It's meant to expose and to entice. Now, let's go back even further. Let's go to Judges 21. Judges 21. We have a section where, because of some bad things that the Benjamites did, Israel got together and they nearly wiped them out, these Benjamites. And then they got to thinking later, oh man, they were our brothers. We really needed to find a way for them to continue as a tribe. And so they try to figure out how to get the survivors wives. And they go and they capture several, I think about 400 wives. They capture them, but that's not enough for the remaining Benjamites. So they're trying to discuss how on earth they can get these wives for these Benjamites, because they have actually made an oath not to give their own sons to the their own daughters to the Benjamite sons. And they don't want to break their oath. What do we do? And they said, I have an idea. Every year, the ladies go into the field and they do this dance. And I can't vouch for this, but the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud, implies that this dance is a dance for God, but done in such a way that it's enticing to the boys. Pick me, pick me. Let's think about family. This is one day a year that the ladies get to, and the boys, I guess, get to figure out a marriage without the prior arrangement from the parents. And that's according to the Talmud.
It's no wonder my dogmatic Baptist background didn't allow dancing.
That's true.
That's right.
That is
You can't
true.
have premarital sex because it might lead to dancing. But no, I'm kidding. But it is just this dance that's described in Judges, according to the Talmud, which is written by the Jews, looking back. I grant you, it's a commentary looking back. They think that this dance was not a lascivious dance, but an enticing dance that got the danders up of the guys that might be watching. So they said, let's have these Benjamites go out in the field, hide, and then grab the lady of their choice. And they can be...
Sometimes I wonder.
Well, yeah. And that way...
And like any dance would have to be enticing. I mean, hello.
But that way, we're not giving our daughters in marriage, they're taking our daughters in marriage. So we're not breaking our oath. See, that's where that happens.
If you say so.
Somehow this, I can't help but think this permission to use their daughters kind of reminds me of Lot offering his two daughters
Oh,
to
yeah.
the Sodomites. It just, the whole thing
Yeah.
makes my skin crawl.
We in our Western culture don't think like
Been
this.
around a long time.
Some of the Eastern cultures still think like this today, but especially in that day and age. Siblings in general, but daughters especially, were basically just possessions. And they were tools.
Expendable.
Expendable in a way. They were tools. And we see it all the time as political tools. You marry your daughter off to a king or a prince because you want a political alliance. Actually, absolutely. We don't understand it today. It kind of makes us vomit a little bit, but it's because of our Western ideals, our modern Western ideals. If you were raised in that era, in that day and age, in that culture, you probably wouldn't think as much of it. Even arranged marriages. We don't like the idea in our Western culture of arranged marriages. But in Eastern cultures today, they still like it. And it works. Because they talk about, the Western cultures want love before marriage, but we talk about learning love after the marriage. And sometimes that learning love after the marriage is what holds it together. If you worry about the love that happened before a marriage, that might fall apart real easy, as we all know, because married life isn't necessarily the easiest thing. So it's the way we look at it, the perspectives that we have. But this dance was definitely a lascivious-oriented dance. It meant to get his dander up, and it was his birthday. It makes sense, let's celebrate the birthday. And the guy was drunk. And we're going to stop there because next week we're going to talk about the gift that he offered and how she took him up on it. And then we're going to talk about, was Matthew 14 verse 13 Jesus' response to that, or was it not? What does Matthew mean when he says When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew.
To a lonely place by himself.
Yes. What does that point back to? Or does it point back? Or is it just one of those transitional phrases that Matthew is known to use? And it just says, okay, moving on, here's the next story I have. Okay, so we'll talk about that as well, and then we'll get into the feeding of the 5,000.
Eventually, we threw all the dancing.
We had to do the dancing. It was a matter of curiosity for me, but then I found, the stuff on Song of Solomon and the Judges. I was like, oh my goodness.
Well, I think that same type of dance is a lot of what's promoting our, what do they call it? They're taking our children and human trafficking.
Oh, human trafficking, yeah.
I think the same attitude and mindset.
Yeah, you put that dance on
behind
TikTok today, TikTok dance, and then all of a sudden, whoo.
Well, you want to know what my mother told me when I was a young boy? When the American Bandstand was on.
Oh, what'd she say?
She said, son, don't watch that, or they're shaking the bacon.
Shaking the bacon. Yeah, Elvis. When Elvis went on, they had to do waist up because all that leg movement, that was a no-go. That's right.
What she said.
Don't you watch that?
All right, let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you so much for the wonder that is your word and all the nuggets of interest that we can find in it. Help us, Lord, as we look at these bits of your word. Help us to understand better the culture that it was written in, the meaning that it was supposed to have, and how we can apply it in our own lives today. Father, help us to really do this in a way that we can absorb your spirit and shine your light even greater. Help us, Father, to understand that shining your light can be fun and can be full of joy. And help us to smile as we live our kingdom life so that others can see us and go, wow, I want that. Thank you, Father, for Jesus. Thank you for the salvation that is ours because of him, because of his willingness to come to this earth, to live sinlessly and to sacrifice his life and to give his blood in our place, Father. Thank you so much for that gift and help us to live it out. It's through him we pray. Amen.
Amen.